back to another episode of Leading with Your Gut. I'm your host, Jenna Renee Shellman. Today is Sunday. It's about 1:45 p.m. Today's date, my goodness, I don't even know what today is. Today is June 7th, Sunday, June 7th. And like I mentioned on my last episode, which I received a lot of responses about, I feel like in light of everything that is going on, myself as a Black woman, as a woman of color, I have not been amplifying my voice or using my platform in the constructive way that my inner voice wants me to. So I am on this journey of change and doing better. And before I introduce my guest this week, who I'm really, really excited about, I want to talk to you about my upcoming class that I have on Wednesday, the 10th at 11 a.m. I will be teaching a class on understanding privilege. This is an introductory class that is free. I do ask that if you want to participate, that you do donate to one of the organizations that I will have listed in the show notes. But this class is an exciting class because I will be teaching and going deep into privilege. And the way that I'll be doing this is explaining privilege, one, from my own knowledge of it, and two, my privilege of being a woman who is mixed, and also understanding what my privileges aren't, being a woman who is mixed and who is of color. So in this first introductory class, you will be challenged to dive deep into your privilege. You will be gaining some awareness of how you've misused your privilege. I'm going to be sharing how I have been misusing my privilege. And you're going to learn a couple strategies on how you can use your awareness and start to use your awareness to really continue understanding your privilege so you can ultimately be a better person in your community, at work, with your friends, with your families, and to be able to amplify people of color, be able to amplify Black voices, and hopefully ultimately be able to amplify people who are different than you, people who have different sexual orientations, people who come from different socioeconomic statuses, and so on. So this introductory class, and then the in addition to this, I will be teaching a 4-part paid class. It is definitely for the person who really wants to delve into their racial privilege, people who are curious about how to pivot their thinking when it comes to everyday perspectives, people who are committed to change the conversations at work and within their network, and people who are really ready to protect and stay an ally, not only stay an ally, but first become an ally, right? And then stay a forever ally to Black people of color, and ultimately other groups that have been oppressed. Now, I do also want to say that in wake and of light of everything, this should not be a trendy topic or a trending topic. This should be something that is ongoing in your lives, not just today, not just next week, not just next month, not just for Black History Month. This should be something that should be ongoing the rest of your life if you truly want to become and be a better ally to your community. So more details on the introductory course are going to be in my show notes. Like I said, it's going to take place at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. This Wednesday, 11 a.m. I already have, I think, 60 people who've registered for the class, which is huge. And I will definitely be sharing my paid course as well. And the introductory course of that is something that you are open to. So with all that in mind, feel free to check the show notes when you're done. I want to now introduce to you my childhood friend, Shalanee Joyner, to the show. Shalanee is a Black woman. She is a woman of color. She's 34, just like myself. She is a Seattle native, as myself, who left for a number of years to attend undergraduate school and graduate school outside of Seattle and outside of Washington State. She went to Chapman University for undergrad, and then she studied in grad school at ASU in Arizona. Like I said, her and I have been friends since first grade, I believe. We've known each other for a long time. And her and I have a lot of similarities. One, we grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood here in Shoreline. We went to predominantly white schools, and we grew up with predominantly white friends, right? So we have a lot of different exchanges about our experiences. We were also one of, the few Black families. My family is interracial. Shalanee's family is Black, but we were one of the only Black families and interracial families growing up in Shoreline at this time. So Shalanee is here to talk to me and talk to you. One, we're just kind of going to shoot the shit a little bit about good old times. And two, we're going to talk about the things that we experienced growing up, the comments, the perspective that we have as being women of color, as being Black, and then also talking about our privileges that we have too, and recognizing those. So I want to welcome Shalanee Joyner to the show.
Well, thank you, Jenna. I really appreciate the invite and being able to speak to your audience. So this is such a joy.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining me. It was really good to see you from the car yesterday, from the Black Lives Matter march yesterday. Mm-hmm. It was so nice. How did you and your family like it?
It was great. So, as Jenna was saying, our families, we grew up in this neighborhood called Shoreline, and both of our families still have our childhood homes. So they both still live there. So there was a march on foot, and also a car kind of protest parade. And of course, Jenna and I saw each other passing by
in the cars
during the car portion.
Yeah. Yeah. I was, I don't know about you, but when we were driving through, we didn't march because, one, right now I'm currently living at my parents' house. You can see if you're watching the video that I'm in my parents' rec room right now, but, we went to the speeches. I thought the speeches were great. And then instead of marching, we decided to do the car parade. And the reason being is because we are worried about COVID, right? And since I live with my parents, they are in their 60s. It just didn't seem, it didn't seem safe to be out amongst a lot of people for a duration of time. But as we were doing the car parade, the only thing I could think about at that time was, I wish my grandparents were here to see this.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember my dad, we were impressed, first of all, that so many people in Shoreline, Washington showed up. Honestly, I did not have the expectation that many people would be there, and neither did my parents. And I remember when we got home, my father made a comment saying, I've never seen something like this. This is incredible. Like, with all the diversity being socioeconomic, brown people, Black people, white people, young people, older people, just the amount of people that wanted to come out in support of this cause. So, I had that sentiment as well.
Mm-hmm. I was kind of overwhelmed, honestly, by it. And not just by that, by being in it, even though I was in my car, just by the whole week or so, seeing so many people, particularly white people coming out. Kind of like what your dad said, like my dad, just like your dad, grew up, was born around in the 50s, right? My dad grew up in a mostly predominantly a Black neighborhood in the Central District when it was that back in the day. And he said throughout his times of, through the civil movement and through protests and whatnot, he has never in his life, he is 66, I believe, if I can do my math right. He has never in his life ever seen anything like this before. And so that's why we had this kind of like sentimental exchange of, we really wish that his parents, my grandparents, were there to see this, because this is something that they fought for forever, and honestly till their grave.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's something that's unprecedented. And I think that's why it's making waves throughout the nation. now that we have these allies, and people are, willing to stand up and make it known and make their voices heard, that they, will no longer sit back and watch these injustices happen, and, are recognizing, that the systemic racism in this country and the different things that are going on, and listening to Black people and listening to their experiences, and, it's standing up for that. And, I'm grateful for them. And I think that's an essential part of how things are going to have to change in this country. As we know, most of the leaders and people that are judges and council members, et cetera, a lot of those people are not people of color, are not, Black, brown. So, we need those allyships, and it's amazing to see the people that are, stepping up and asking questions and asking, what can I do? How can I help? And asking those questions in the right way, and, having the correct intentions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, for me, it's really about how can we be curious, and it's about what should we really be going after? Should we, and my thought process is we should be going after policies and people who are in a position that they shouldn't be in a position for, where they're really just benefiting themselves, or only one predominant group of people, which are white people, right? Like, thinking about Trump, honestly, like, he is only making himself and honestly white men honestly better, right? And so that's kind of my whole thing, is how can we tackle this now that we're getting more voices? More people are getting pissed, more people are angry. And that's another question I've had in my head, is why all of a sudden now are people like getting angry? I think a lot of people of color have had that question too, but I just hope that people are going after more of like the policies that are in place and changing those policies so there is like equity truly for all groups of people. So have you thought about that, Shalanee? Have you thought about like, what was it about, the last 3 weeks that, like, why are people like pissed now? Like, why weren't they pissed like years ago? Why weren't they pissed after, all the different black men and Black women who have died from police brutality? Or why haven't they been pissed by just being able to see the racism that's systemically within our country? Have you thought about that?
I think I've given it some decent thought. I think obviously a lot of it is, everybody has a cell phone now, and all of this is shot on camera. And as Will Smith said, I don't remember the exact quote, but he said something like, racism is not getting worse in America. It's just being filmed.
Right.
So right. I think that you have these instances with Ahmaud Arbery and then George Floyd, like, coming sequentially right after one another. And, with blatant footage of what is happening. So I think it's become so blatant that people can no longer turn their eyes to it, or it's harder to ignore. When, you have footage of 8 minutes of a man, ex-police officer, putting his knee on somebody he's arresting, and restricting, his oxygen, and that horrible video that we all witnessed. And then, right before that, we had Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and, just hearing of these horrific events. I think it finally just makes it so blatant that people are uncomfortable.
Right.
And, they can no longer just be like, oh, well, this doesn't happen that often, or we don't see this. Like, how could you look at yourself in the mirror after seeing these videos and be like, well, somehow that's okay. So I guess I think that's part of kind of what is attributed to people starting to pay attention, and things that you and I have been well aware of for years, or since, we were children. These things have been maybe not but brought to our attention, like we've known about these things, but other people, they're starting to feel uncomfortable, and they're starting to ask questions. And I don't know about you, but I know I've experienced a number of those things among friends that I have who great people, great perspectives and points of view, but they'd always stick up for injustices, but they were never outraged by things maybe necessarily. And now I, through talking to them and just listening, they're outraged. It's starting that kind of to move towards that. Not that, no, this is just not okay. Now it's like, oh no, I see this and I'm not okay with it, and I'm upset about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my first reaction to that, Shalanee, because I definitely experienced that too in my network, is at first I was really pissed about it. Like, I was pissed. Like, Van Jones had this interview and he kind of flat out like called out people who were super ignorant and said, it's too late for you to be innocent and yada, yada, yada. And at first, I was angry too. And I know that a lot of people are angry because like you, like myself, we've been trying to find ways to amplify our voices. But then what happens is that like they're usually like shut down. Right. I don't know if you've had that experience, but I have had that experience in the different organizations that I've worked with, and people that are close to me that I love. And so it has been hard for me to fully speak up because I know that there's a chance that I'm going to get shot down and that my thoughts and my views won't be protected. So then as a result, it's just easier for me to just shut the fuck up, honestly. And I'm calling myself out on that, right? For not being brave enough to step up further. But that is honestly like the truth. And, I understand why there are a lot of Black people who are still infuriated, right? That people, especially, people of privilege and people who are white, are just kind of now opening up the curtain and saying, what? Really? Like I get that. I get that fuel and I get that anger. It just kind of now depends on, okay, what are you going to do with that anger now? Are you going to do something constructive with it now, or what is your plan? So
right. And to your point, what you had said earlier, that it's trending,
right?
That is something I've thought a lot about, like how I'm happy to see all of this and the marches and the protests and they've continued. I was watching news earlier and I think this is the 13th day or something, but when is this going to inevitably, come to a halt and we're not going to see the demonstration, or is it, we're going to see a halt and no more demonstrations? And is this no longer going to be trendy?
Right.
Will people forget, or it won't be important anymore? And I know that's been a big topic of discussion in the Black Lives Matter movement and just in the community and stuff. When they did Blackout Tuesday, just like, this is nice, but we need to keep moving forward. Donate, don't forget. This is not, once it's not cool anymore or trending, or it's not on the news all of the time, it's still systematically happening throughout the United States and the world. So, that's going to be an interesting, it's going to be interesting to see, and it'll be an interesting conversation to have, because how quickly people will forget.
Right. Exactly. And I'm worried about that too, right? Like, I'm worried about a lot of people are thinking, okay, great, we're going to march for a little bit, we're going to demonstrate for a little bit, and then after a few weeks, we're going to go back to business as normal. And I really hope that that's not the case. I really hope that regardless of where people are at in their lives or what race they are, that they are using this to do better for themselves and do better for the community around them the best way that they can possible throughout their life. This is not just like a, kind of like what I was talking about with Black History Month, right? Like it has always bothered me that there is a Black History Month, because it's basically saying we should only talk about Black people 1 out of the 12 months of the year. And I just find that absolutely ludicrous. We should be celebrating Black people and Black voices throughout the year, and we should be celebrating Indigenous people throughout the year, and LGBTQ, and so on and so on and so on. It shouldn't just be dedicated to like 1 month, and then 11 months it's like we're gonna just celebrate whiteness or like white culture. And maybe around Thanksgiving, we'll talk about Indigenous people, you know? So these are the types of like, I would almost say like even in someone who was a teacher, someone who's been in the education system in a predominantly white neighborhood, you know, the things that, you know, parents and teachers can start challenging the administration, start challenging those policies and curriculum, right? Like, why is it that we only celebrate Black people 1 month out of the year, that type of thing. So I really hope that this does not turn into a trending topic, that the people who responded to my posts on Facebook and Instagram, whatever, the people who are texting me and emailing me and the 60 people who have signed up for my class, like I really hope that they're at a point in their life where they can say, I am ready to do better, whatever that means, right? I'm ready to do better. So
yeah, it's going to take a lifelong commitment, like you said.
It is, right. Mm-hmm. And like no one's perfect. I am definitely not perfect, and I am definitely not this like woke human being, right? It's a lifelong learning on my end too of how I can do better.
Absolutely, same here.
Yeah. I kind of want to talk about what I said earlier about just your experiences, Shalanee, especially growing up in Shoreline, what it was like for you being one of the few Black people who grew up in Shoreline.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think to start it, I mean, you said, like Jenna mentioned before, we met in first grade at elementary school. And you were for a long time one of my few Black friends. Mm-hmm. I knew other kids my age and stuff that were Black through maybe some organizations, but like through Jack and Jill, et cetera, that my family was involved in. And I appreciated that. And it was a great experience, but I wouldn't say I was necessarily very close with those individuals. So I think probably the first, very close friend that I had was you. Mm-hmm. And then I had other, you and I both knew Gina, and she was another a woman of color. Yeah. But the only Black friend I had was you, and the only other Black household that I, would regularly go to and have dinner with their family, and you'd come to my house, that was you. So it was just, clearly we were the minority, but it was very, obvious. And so I did recognize that at a young age.
And I was going to ask for you, do you kind of remember the age or like the grade you're in where you really kind of like recognize that? Or do you have like a specific moment when you were like, recognize that your skin color is different than a lot of the people around you?
So I think some of the first experiences I had that maybe I recognized it, I was on a swim team that was in my neighborhood. There was a community pool, and just realizing like the difference that I had to go through with my hair, wearing a swim cap, even though most competitive swimmers, you wear a swim cap, but the chlorine with your hair, and that, hey, I can't use this herbal essence shampoo with everybody else in the shower, locker room, whatever, because this will make my hair feel like straw.
Yeah.
Those are just, kind of some of the differences, having to explain like, oh no, like this is different for me. Uh-huh. My hair does something different when I get in the water. And I have to take care of it like this. So I think that was probably how I started to realize something first, that, this is so different. So that was one of the instances. And I think you and I met in first grade in elementary school. And I knew about the N-word. I knew it existed. I just I was not around people in our community, Black people, that ever said it. We don't ever say it in my household. It wasn't a word, that I hear it in that sense. It was, this is a bad word. And this is what it means. And I knew what it meant. I don't remember exactly what grade we were in elementary school, but there was an individual, a boy, that on the playground, I just know we were outside, we were on the playground, and he called me the N-word. And that was a really profound moment for me, because I didn't think that word would have would have so much power and make me feel so much of a certain way. I thought I would always be able to just let it roll off my back, like just, okay, you shouldn't say that. That's a bad word. And I remember I just burst into tears, and it was a horrific experience. And I remember the first thing that I did so people got involved, adults, teachers, supervisors, or whatnot. And I honestly forget how he was reprimanded, but he was dealt with somehow. But I went to the nurse's office or something, and I said, please don't call my mom, because I didn't want them to know that had happened. And clearly they did. And she showed up to pick me up. I don't know. It was just I was supposed to take the bus home, and she showed up to pick me up. And I was just kind of embarrassed. I was mortified. It was just a lot of emotion and experience. So I think that was probably the most defining moment where I realized, oh, okay, like this can happen. And, we were just playing outside, all kids. I'd been in classes with this individual for a number of years, and I had no idea that was a word that he felt comfortable using. Obviously, he was taught about it inside of his home, and that it was somehow okay. So I think those were probably the moments that I kind of had that realization that things were going to be different, or things were different.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. You know how, I don't know if your parents do this when they're like, where were you when this person died? Or I was here and I remember this. Literally, Shalanee, I will not forget that day. Like, I remember that day. And the reason why I remember that day is because I remember how I felt. Right? Like, I remember I felt sad for you. I felt sad for me because you and I looked alike, right? You and I are both Black. And so by him calling you the N-word, he called me that too.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I remember, just like you, thinking, I knew what the word was, and I'd heard it, and I knew that it was a bad word, right? Like, I understood in my mind, like, this is a bad word, but I didn't understand its power coming from a white boy. Now, I understand he was, like 10, you guys. Okay, I get it. He was a kid. But the power that it had, and he knew that power because he obviously heard it probably at home, right? From people who have these viewpoints. And that was the first... I had definitely understood that I was different years before that, but that was the first time that I felt inferior.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that was the first time I really looked around at my school and my neighborhood, and I was like, it's me and Shalanee.
Yeah.
And like a few other people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think I'm even racking my brain trying to remember if there were any other Black kids when we were at that school at that time. Maybe there was one or two. There was a few.
Yeah, there was a few, but the fact of the matter is that there was a few. That's the fact, right? Like that was the fact, is that there were a few. What about like as you got older, like especially when you went to private school here in Seattle, what were the experiences like for you there? Because I went to public school, so totally different, but
yeah. So right after, what was it? So in our elementary school technically went till 6th grade, but the school that I went to from 6 till 12 obviously started at 6th grade. So I left and went to a private school starting in 6th grade. And I mean, again, of course, I was one of the few minorities, and definitely one of the few Black people in the class and in the school. I mean, there were only a handful of us in each grade. So, I mean, but at that point, this is what I also want to bring up. I was used to it. It becomes normal.
Yes.
You don't question it. Yeah. You just think, this is my experience. And I was aware, obviously, that in other more diverse communities, or, Black communities or Latino communities, et cetera, they have more diversity, and that's what their schools will look like. But so I knew that, but I knew that, oh, okay, I'm going to this privileged private school. Like, I'm going to be one of the few Black people. So I I guess I just accepted it early on. So it didn't like jolt me or anything. I just knew going into it. But yeah, it was an interesting experience, especially because a lot of these children came from other feeder private schools, so they knew each other. And I did not know anybody when I started because I came from a school up north of Seattle, like a public school. So not only it was like, okay, hi, I'm one of the few Black people in this class. Now it's like I also didn't go to school with all of you at Bearchi before, and socioeconomically, I mean, a lot of the people were here, and we were, here. Grew up in a upper middle class family, but when I transitioned to that school, there were a lot of kids with an abundance of privilege. So it was interesting, but yeah, it becomes normal. You're just like, oh, okay. Like I'll just slide it and try to blend in. And there was one girl, her name was similar to mine, and we were about the same height, and maybe about the same skin color, and they always used to mix our names up. And I thought that was always interesting.
So infuriating. Yeah. And then what about when you went to Chapman, and then after that, when you went to ASU, what was that experience like for you?
So Chapman, again, it's in Orange County, California, which is a very white conservative area. Obviously colleges by nature are a little bit more liberal. But same kind of thing. It was I don't know what the breakdown of the student population was when I went there, but clearly Black people are a very, very small minority of people that attended there. So again, it was just the same thing that I got used to. Same when I went to ASU, there was a little more diversity. I was part of I'm part Native American, so I was part of some groups for Native Americans. So there was a little more diversity in that way that I was surrounded by that. But honestly, it's about at that age when I kind of just realized that I was so comfortable with that, and that and I didn't like it. So it took a while for me to get to that point within myself, to a certain age where I was like, okay, I recognize that this is what I've been surrounded with my whole life, but I would like to see this change. And that, this isn't this isn't what the world is like. This is what, like, a snapshot of what, privilege, Black, white people, etc. Like this, so that's when I started to be more cognizant about it. And just also kind of, I think in college too, I started to realize a lot of more microaggressions, racist microaggressions, and just how people would place me oh, this is my friend. Yeah. And, I've had to come to a realization for myself and different things, but I got there, but people, because I am fair, I have a fair skin tone, people would just automatically assume, oh, which one of your parents is white?
Right.
And neither of my parents are white. Both of my parents are African-American Black. I'm sure there's, some great-great-great-grandfather or something that, was, we know that, but that was Scandinavian. My dad did an ancestry DNA thing, but that is not how we were raised in our household. That's not how my father or my mother were raised. So people would always make that assumption, and I sometimes would let it slide. And then I had that moment where I was like, why are you doing this?
Right.
Because it's making them comfortable.
Yes. Yeah,
and
girl.
I'm sure you have a lot of, because you do have a mother that is Caucasian, and I'm sure you have some very similar experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like more so in my 20s is when I really started opening my curtain, right? Honestly, of my privilege and my acceptance of the white community, to be honest with you. And I definitely would get a lot of discriminatory remarks from all people, right? Because I am light skinned, I am biracial, I am black, and I am white. Shalanee, I think your skin actually is lighter than mine. Girl, I get it when you say that you've gotten a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the main things that I've gotten from different people are you don't seem black. That's one. And I have received that by both white and black people. Okay. And that is very hurtful because that means that you have to act and behave and say certain things to be black, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. And then I've had people say to me, you're just a white girl, which what the hell does that mean? Right. Also super offensive to me. And then of course I have my number one favorite of what are you? I'm a woman. That's always what I respond back. I'm a human. And then people get really uncomfortable. I've had people say, how did you get your tan? I talk about in a previous episode about how a CEO on an interview like 6 months ago flat out said, how did you get your tan? I just straight up told him to his face from my parents. Like, I don't even know how to answer that question. It's just so ignorant, and I get these questions. Those types of questions, I get them on a regular basis versus not on a regular basis. And I remember in my 20s feeling really insecure about who I was, one as a woman, just in general, right? Like, dear God, I think most people in their 20s, a lot of people in their 20s are just insecure in general about themselves. But
right.
I was just insecure in general, but I was definitely really insecure about my race, about being black, about being mixed, about wanting to say the right thing to one group of people and then wanting to say the right thing to another group of people just so I can impress them and please them so then they don't hound me with uncomfortable conversations, right? So what I found myself doing was just trying to please the people around me, which were predominantly white people. Right. It was just easier for me. And like I said earlier, those times I did kind of try to say something or I would amplify my voice, it's like I was heard, but like it just didn't feel like not really.
Right.
So to me, I just felt like I was outnumbered. And then I didn't have a whole lot of black friends. I have a lot of people of color who are my friends, but not necessarily black friends. And so I guess in my mind, I felt like, well, I don't have like this type of support group. And so I was confused for years. So I completely understand what you're talking about.
And that's a big thing too. Just what you were speaking about is, trying to kind of being like a chameleon. Like when I'm around white people, I'll kind of act or do things slightly differently. And then when I'm around black people, and it's an interesting thing because I think first of all, white people like to put you in a box and it's more comfortable for them. And maybe I think they don't realize how they're being prejudiced sometimes when this happens, but it's comfortable for them to be like, oh, this is my mixed friend Jenna, or this, maybe they won't say it out loud, but this is my light black skin friend Shalanee or whatnot. And then it just makes it easier somehow, like, oh, well, she's not really that black.
Right.
Like, look, she went to private school.
Right.
And she went to undergrad. You and I both went to great, small private undergrads. And you and I both went to grad school. And she went to grad. Like, look at her. Look how eloquently spoken she is, etc. And then the other thing that I noticed that you spoke about, which I've felt a lot in the Black community, it's like, then you get it from the other side, or at least I did when I was younger. I just felt like I didn't quite belong. And maybe that a lot of that was probably because of the neighborhood that we were raised in, the schools I went to, and unfortunately the color of my skin. And I think that has come a long way. Now it's like, oh, my light skinned sister, but that was a thing too.
Yeah.
Like, not feeling like, oh, I don't quite belong because my experiences, most of my friends are white and I'm mostly around white people. So that was definitely a thing. So both of my parents are black, but I did experience a lot of those things that you're talking about. Just
right. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think that there are some people out there that believe that racism only exists from white people, and that is so not true whatsoever. Racism exists in all groups of races, and it definitely exists in the Black community, in Black groups, just like what you were saying. There is racism from people who are lighter skinned, not acknowledging darker skinned individuals, and vice versa. Then there are darker skinned individuals who are don't want to listen to or accept light-skinned people into their community. So it definitely goes back and forth. My uncle, who is Black, he is a Black man, grew up in Seattle. He moved to New York, I think, when he was 19, to go to school out there. And, he's lived out in New York and New Jersey ever since. He's in his 50s. And I was talking to him the other day, and he told me that when he went to New York, he received so much flack for not being Black enough.
Man, your uncle is very dark.
I know, but what I mean by that is by just culturally, he's not Black enough. And he felt like, there are times where he had to prove himself. Like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm Black. Like, what are you talking about? And it was because, he came from a city, Seattle, that is very strongly white. And so he was discriminated by his own community for being Black, not being Black enough.
Right. Like the things that he would say, or maybe his, expressions. Right.
Right. And have you read Michelle Obama's book, Becoming? Mm-hmm. She talks about this too, about how her and Barack have been discriminated against by their own community by speaking a certain way, or not saying a certain thing, or going to certain Ivy League schools and such and such and such, and to that there is prejudice there, right? So there is racism in all different groups of people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I did not know that he had, it makes sense because
it does.
Seattle doesn't have, we've grown leaps and bounds, but probably when your dad and uncle were growing up here, there wasn't a deep feeling of Black community and Black culture.
Yeah.
So then you go to a city where that does exist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think it existed for them because, my dad, when they grew up in the Central District, and that whole area was predominantly Black. Those were Black neighborhoods. And so they had that experience. But I think when I'm talking about Seattle as a whole, Seattle as a whole, there's always been, it has been more predominantly white than it has been Black. And so then going to New York, where it's such a diverse,
they have more than just one pocket of there's one pocket of diversity and, small one-offs in Seattle, but in New York, it's right. Like what you're saying, it's a melting pot.
Yeah.
And there are so many different, it's a different socioeconomic thing, but there are so many different people there, communities, cultures, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Have you experienced a time where you have felt like, because you grew up with lighter skin, because you grew up in white neighborhoods and went to white schools, do you feel like where you have recognized your privilege?
Absolutely. Yeah. Without a doubt. I hope this doesn't come off wrong, but I don't believe that, I haven't recognized it or felt like I've experienced, but like I've ever walked into a room or walked up behind somebody or something and somebody looked at me immediately like I was a threat to them.
Right.
I don't really feel that happens to me. I think a part of it has got to be right that I'm a woman, because in general, women, they, you've got that for you, and maybe they recognize you as not as threatening as a Black man. Mm-hmm. But certainly, I know that the assumption usually is, oh, she must be white or part white or something to that effect. So. Absolutely, without a doubt, I know that I've been treated differently. And like I said before, it just makes some people more comfortable. Oh, you're not. And I've had comments made in front of my face. And at the time, I was not in a place or, I guess I wasn't strong enough to say something or didn't know exactly who I was yet. But I've had people be like, oh, but she's really light. Like, basically the undertones of that, I mean, I'm not going to say the word, but it's basically like, oh, she's a good, and like this is a good Black person. Like you could, so I've a number of times I've heard that, or oh, you're just as pale as I am, like in the winter and things, just individuals making themselves. I can tell by those comments that they're speaking out loud what they're thinking in their brains is, oh, this makes it more comfortable. And I recognize that, people that have darker skin, probably those assumptions that they're taking away from me because I look a certain way and that makes me more comfortable. They're definitely putting those on other people. I've been at a graduation party in college where somebody's grandfather was there. And he was blatantly saying the N-word. In regards, I forget, there was like a football game on, or there was some kind of, it wasn't a football game on, he was referencing some kind of sporting, I think it was football, and talking about a season. And then he said, it's because they had all those, and then he used the N-word. And he had seen me there. I just think that either he didn't care, but I think he didn't care because he didn't completely identify like, oh, there's a
Black girl here,
there's a Black person here. I think, so or he just was comfortable enough like with it. Or I've had people make the distasteful joke that I would be a house slave because I've heard that once or twice. Because as during slavery, those that had lighter skin
worked inside
because that was presentable, and that so definitely I've experienced that, and now I won't have any part of it, but before I just kind of when you're younger and you're trying to fit in, you don't maybe know what's going on, you just kind of sit back and you understand it, and it hurts you, but I rolled with it for a while because I didn't know what else to do.
Exactly. It's this big kind of idea that you and I and a lot of other people of color and a lot of other Black people are being assimilated into white culture. Right? Like America is predominantly a white culture, right? And so other cultures have been looked at as inferior, right? And so I think for you and I, because we grew up around so many white people and went to white schools, I think we've kind of like naturally kind of assimilated into part of that. And and then when we try to like just be who we are who we are, Shalanee. You are who you are and I am who I am. But when we try to speak up and speak out, it's like hard to like amplify, right? Like with that guy who was saying the N-word, like, did you do anything or not?
I did not. I mean, this was somebody's like 80-year-old grandfather. Right. So there's the age thing that plays into it. Yeah. That you respect your elders. The girl whose grandfather it was, she was aware of it and she was embarrassed. But honestly, she wasn't embarrassed that much.
Yeah.
She was just like, oh, that's kind of how he is. I'm sorry. Like,
and then
like, oh, I just have a little racist grandpa. Like, he's so cute.
But then what about like the other people at the party? Like, did they do anything? Like, did they
honestly no? And that's one of, I'm glad you brought that up because that's actually been something that I have noticed that I've been disappointed in people over time about. Is there is another person of color there. They were not Black. But, they weren't that offended. They're like, oh, just let it go. Or, and then there were other friends of mine that were there that were white, but, and I see as really good friends and they're not racist or overtly prejudiced people. It's just, or prejudice. It's just those biases that, they don't realize.
Yeah.
And everyone, nobody made a big deal of it. And then you don't want to be like, then you let it roll off your back because you don't want to be perceived as the angry Black person.
Exactly.
Or the angry Black woman.
Exactly.
Especially. Yeah.
Yeah. And kind of like what you were saying earlier, how a lot of Black men are perceived as being violent, right? Their bodies are perceived as violent. I feel like I guess the synonym to that, if that's the right word, is like the dark-skinned Black woman is perceived as being angry. Well, she's just an angry Black woman, so I'm not going to listen to her, but I might listen to the light-skinned girl, right? Because she's not dark because she's not dark enough. But that is a fear. That has been a fear of mine. And like I said, guys, I'm calling myself out on my own bullshit of sitting here being like, if I say something, then I'm going to be deemed as the angry Black woman all of a sudden. And then I won't be accepted. And then, you know, and so and then I won't be loved, and so on and so on and so on. It's just been this underlying fear that I've had. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah. And I have the same sentiment that you do, is when I look back at things that I was willing to accept or cite biases or prejudices or things that were said to me, I'm like, why did I let that person think that, or why did I let that slide? And, you know, now I'm in a different space, and I would never, but yeah, totally. I was just in fear of, oh, well, I just better, you know, I guess they're not that angry about it, so I'll just let it go. And then, right, you're the one Black person in the group of friends, so it's like you don't have somebody necessarily coming to your defense. So it's like, okay, so I'm just going to look crazy if I amplify this, and I'm like, you can't do this, da 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 da. No one's going to come to my defense, and then nobody in general in life, nobody likes doing that. If let's just talk about in a group of people, somebody, you know, says something that's not right. Nobody likes being that one person that is like, okay, well, I'm going to say something, and then nobody else backs them up. But that's not a comfortable situation. No. And I think anyone can relate to that. Like, take the race component out of it, where you're just like, no, like, I'm going to stick up, and everybody else knows that person's wrong, but nobody's going to back me up. Like, that's not a comfortable situation. And as humans, we don't like putting ourselves in that situations, but in those situations. But I think at this time, as Black women, as Black people, as allies, etc., we don't have that choice anymore.
No,
we need to put ourselves in those uncomfortable situations and raise our voices.
Yeah. And I definitely feel like the past couple of years, I've been trying to do that better, not just in regards of race, but just in other things as well. But one of the reasons why I launched this podcast, Leading with Your Gut, back in November, was to hear stories about how people embrace their fear, right? And had the courage to do XYZ. They had an inner voice that told them either don't go this way, the way that people want you to go, or do the thing that you truly want to do. And this kind of exemplifies everything that we just talked about. It is so hard to have courage. As you and I just talked about, it is so hard to stand up to people that we love, that we hope love us too, to tell them, you know, what you are saying hurt my feelings. What you're saying is racist, especially if we know that they won't listen, they won't care. And the worst part of it all is like the fear that they won't get it. That's the biggest fear for me, the fear that they won't get it, right? And then being deemed as like the angry Black person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
That's the fear, to be able to look yourself in the mirror and be like, okay, I've got to take certain steps, and I've got to make myself uncomfortable.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was to say, make myself uncomfortable, and as a result, make other people uncomfortable by raising certain subjects.
Right. And we need to be at a point in our lives where talking about things such as race should not be uncomfortable. If it's uncomfortable for you, then something's up, right?
That's the problem, right? Why are you so uncomfortable addressing this?
It shouldn't be uncomfortable. And in the same way that we talk about, you know, LGBTQ rights, right? It's the same type of thing. One thing I want to quickly share, and I have one more question for you before we end. We're almost here at an hour, but in a previous job that I had a manager who was helping me and helping other people hire for their teams because we needed to hire. And I was in an office where me and like, I think 5 other people, maybe at a given time, were like the only people of color. And then me and probably one other person at a given time were the only like Black people. Right. And I want to remind everybody that I'm half Black. So really it was just like one and a half at a given time. Okay. So I definitely understood there were some possibly recruiting prejudices there. I fully understood that. So the person I was reporting to was helping me hire and helping other people hire because it was a bit crazy, busy job, right? And I tried my best to hire a diverse team. And it was funny because the team that I hired actually was kind of known as a diverse team in all regards, meaning, I was the one that led the team who was a Black woman and mixed. I had another Black individual that I hired. I had 2 individuals that were gay. Okay. So in just terms of all groups of diversity in general, I was probably the only team people said you're known for that, whatever. Okay. So just in general, trying to find someone else on my team, I needed the help of someone else because I was too busy. It was too busy in that job. And I remember he brought in a candidate and he had interviewed him and he said, Jenna, I really want you to meet this candidate. I'm so excited about him. And I looked at his resume and it looked like he had someone who was coming out of like UW, I think, college grad, which, hey, I love college grads. And I said, what do you like about him? Just curious before I go and interview him. And he said something along the lines of, I like the fact that he was in a fraternity. And I know, and I kind of right, and I kind of looked at him sideways, and from his contacts, he was this man that I reported to was in a fraternity and went to WSU. So he liked the fact that he was in a fraternity. I think this candidate did come from WSU and that he was a fraternity and went to WSU. And that was the first reason that he gave me, which first of all is if anyone has been a hiring manager, that is probably the worst thing that you can hear, not to disregard or degrade fraternities or sororities whatsoever. But when you're hiring somebody, you should talk about their character first. You like them because they have grit, because they have a good story, they have experience, skill set, not because they're from a fraternity. So I went in and I met him, and he was what he was. He was a white young man who didn't have much experience. He talked a lot about, I think he was maybe president of his fraternity, I'm not sure. I passed on it as what is. And I sat on that comment that my manager said to me because it bothered me. Because the way that I perceived it, a woman of color, is I perceived it as he thought he was a good candidate because he was a white boy coming from a fraternity. That was the way that I took it from him. And I had 2 options. And I think I told one other person on my team that reported to me that I could confide in. And he was like appalled that he said that. And I had 2 options as a leader. I was like, I could either let this slide or I could bring it up in a meeting. Which is more uncomfortable? Bringing it up in a meeting. Okay. My gut was like, you need to do that one. And I did. And I said, I have something I need to tell you, something that made me feel really uncomfortable. And I could tell he got really, his eyes wide. And I told him, and I said, this is how I perceived it. That's how I phrased it. And he was so embarrassed. And of course he was like, that's not what I meant. I used to be in a fraternity and I really believe in a brotherhood and blah, blah, blah. And I just said, just a woman of color hearing that, it just sounds like you're saying a good candidate is someone who is one, white, because there are a predominantly number of white men in fraternities, mm-hmm. right? 1 and 2, they're a man, right? Like those are the 2 things that I heard from you. And so we had this ongoing discussion and he was actually very receptive. And even the next week when we met, he said that he had been doing even more reflection on that and his perspective and how he realized that what he said really highlighted his privilege and really highlighted mm-hmm. the fact that I was not heard, and it really started questioning his recruiting strategy. So that's a case in point where I was so fucking freaked out of my mind. And the thing I said to myself is, what's the worst thing that can happen? Can he fire me? He's not going to fire me. I'm making so much money for that company and he doesn't know how to do my job. If he fires me, he has to do my job. Right. So I kind of looked at it like that. And I said, if I don't say something, then that means I'm not representing 1, Black people, 2, people of color, 3, women, 4, people who are LGBT. Right. Mm-hmm. And so on and so on and so on. So yeah, you guys, that moment freaked me out, literally terrified me.
That's amazing. I don't know if I've had an opportunity on that kind of level and that platform to do something like that. But I mean, that is amazing. That is what needs to be done. Right. To, put yourself out there, make yourself uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Because I'll tell you, the only way I can relate to that is you said, what were my options? And you obviously laid out your options. And I've had not as big of a platform, but I've had situations where I heard something or somebody said something and I weigh in my head, what are my options? And I have taken the route of, okay, I'll just be silent. And that gutted me for like the next, 2-3 days. I am feeling a certain way. So that's amazing. That, you stood up and it's like, right, what are they going to do? When I'm like, hey, this is what I noticed. And I feel like there was some bias here. And what did you mean by this? And reflect on yourself. So that's huge.
I thank you. And I also had a moment too, after it all was said and done. And after I realized that he was very perceptive, right? And I really appreciated him for that. But then I also had a moment too of, is this also my privilege? Is he being receptive to me because I am very light skinned? If I was darker, would he have been as perceptive, or would he have gone to HR, or what would he have done? And so that was a moment in time for me where I checked my privilege and I recognized, like, if I were darker, would the same outcome happen?
Absolutely. I would guess that somebody in that situation that might have not looked like you or I might have, you said you already thought hard about it, but I would imagine that they would think even harder about it. And right, it's just something they would have to grapple with more than you did. I think absolutely that's valid. And, that would probably be the situation because, you look around in a room and everybody looks a certain way. And it's like I said, the chameleon thing, like, it's like, oh, I can kind of go, I just don't want to upset them. But, sometimes your mere presence, being darker or something is already upsetting somebody.
Right.
Or is already being noticed, a lot more noticed, or what have you. So that's definitely, I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's extremely valid.
Well, this has been a great conversation. We've talked for about an hour now. Is there anything, Shalanee, that you would like to say that we didn't highlight, or is there any advice to viewers, to people who either people who don't get it and want to, or people who are of color, or people who are Black listening to this? Is there any type of advice or any words you want to say at all?
I think we covered a great amount of topics, and this has been wonderful. I don't know if advice, but just what we talked about in the beginning. Just don't let this be a trending thing. As an ally, even as a Black person, keep finding resources, different things, educating yourself. How can I keep bringing this up in a way that matters? Like, who should I be voting for in elections? And it's not just the president. It's, local elections, getting involved in grassroots things, etc. So that goes for all people, Black, white people, women, men of color, anybody. Keep vigilant, keep active, keep questioning yourself. I think, in regards to everything in life, if you're not growing, you're kind of dying. So, keep educating yourself.
Word, Shalanee, say that again.
Yeah, if you're not growing, you're dying.
Yeah.
If you're not progressing, learning more about yourself, the people, your community, everybody around you, keep learning. Because I think, knowledge is power. Obviously, I know that's cliche, but I think, the better you educate yourself and the people you surround yourself with, diversity. And we kind of talked about this. That doesn't just mean, oh, I have a few Black and Latina friends or whatnot. There's a ton of different diversity, socioeconomic, gender, all of those things, orientation. Excuse me if I'm not saying that correctly, but there's all of those things. Look at the circle of people you surround yourself with. And if they all look like you and think like you, then you need to think about that.
I agree. Yeah. Thank you so much for being on the show. This has been a really good conversation. Thank you for being so open and vulnerable and talking about uncomfortable things and experiences that you went through. It's not easy. So I commend you for doing those things. Before we sign off, those of you that are listening, I do want to remind you again that I am hosting a free introductory course. It's called Diving Deep into Your Privilege. We're just going to talk a lot about self-awareness and how maybe we've misused our privilege. It's 45 minutes. About 60 people have signed up so far. It's on Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time via Zoom. I'm going to put the Eventbrite information in my notes. I do ask that participants please donate to an organization that is listed in the Eventbrite. You don't need to tell me how much you donated, but please just donate. I'm also, in addition to that, teaching a 4-part paid series, diving even deeper into privilege and awareness, and really teaching you strategies and ways that you can become a better ally in your community. 1, for people who are Black, 2, for people who are of color, but then and so on, and how you can take this learning and teaching and be able to amplify it to different groups of people. Like what a lot of people are saying, we're not free until all of us are free. Right. So this is more about race. This is more than just race. But I'm going to use that first to highlight this. So go in my notes. Please feel free to share with anybody. And I'll see you there. Thank you so much, Shalanee, for joining the show. Have a good one.